my name is Steve, and this is video number 96 of my ongoing series of anchor tests where I'm trying to find the world's best performing anchors. Now, the last video was a 17 anchor shootout. It was a veering test where I used a rope rode, and I chose to do that because of limitations in my equipment. I thought it was a decent test. I thought we could get a comparison at least. I do realize that most people use chain in their rodes, and personally I like to use all chain, and I'm well aware of numerous benefits to that. But again, for the test, that was what I could do. I didn't have a windlass, so for the larger anchors I had to use rope only. But I did read a lot of comments that were not in favor of that. So I aim to please here, and I have conducted a new series of veering tests using a significant amount of chain. I did not use the larger anchors. I still don't have a windlass, and I just cannot lift a chain and a 45-pound anchor repeatedly. I can do it once or twice, but then my back really starts to hurt. So I've selected a new test based on 4 smaller anchors. Now, I already owned a 21-pound spade and a 17-pound Excel, and we saw those in the rope rode. But I needed a couple more anchors to sort of round out the field here. As you saw in that previous test, I made the observation that the non-roll bar, thick fluked anchors worked much better than the thin fluked roll bar anchors in that sandy mud seabed. But I don't have any of those roll bar thin fluked anchors in this side ranged until now. Last week I went ahead and bought myself a 22-pound Rocna. It's brand new. It is not modified. As you know, I modified at least one other anchor in the past, including a Rocna. I also stated that I observed that my larger Rocna was manufactured with a defect, I believe. I believe the shank was just welded on crooked. I can happily report that this Rocna is constructed very well. Big welds, everything is straight, nothing is bent, nothing wrong with this anchor. It's perfect. Also last week I bought a 17-pound Mantis, brand new, no problem, no modifications, everything is just as it should be. These are going to be a great anchor comparison. We've got 2 17-pound anchors of completely different styles. We've got a 22 and a 21-pound anchor of completely different styles. This is going to make for a very good shootout. Now, in addition to conducting a series of veering pulls at the sandy mud site, I also did the full complete series at my soft mud site. So try to stick with the whole video. I'm trying to keep it short, maybe under 35 or 40 minutes. It's all very, very interesting results. For those that are not familiar with my previous veering test, let me give you the test protocol. The anchors are set straight ahead at a prescribed amount of thrust. Then I'd simply turn the engine of the boat, the test boat, just a few degrees, and that starts the boat moving in a sideways direction. And I let that continue all the way through 180 degrees. At the end of 180 degrees, I straighten out the engine, the boat stops moving, and then I increase thrust up to either the boat's maximum thrust or the maximum holding power of the anchor. If an anchor fails to produce significant holding power in the straight line portion, I just discontinue. If it just can't do it, I don't bother trying. Last thing we'll talk about before the footage is the chain. I have selected 80 feet of 5/16 chain to put into this rode. Total rode lengths are 125 feet and up, so in addition to the 80 feet of chain, there will be 9/16 nylon. Now, I think most people will agree that 5/16 chain is very heavy for 20-pound range anchors. I think normally you'd see 1/4-inch chain. But that's good. We want to see a lot of catenary. A lot of people like to use heavy chain or all chain rodes, lots of scope, and this is certainly going to qualify as a heavy chain and generous scope test. Enjoy. Okay, first anchor we'll look at is the 17-pound Mantis. This is a sandy mud seabed, 25 feet deep, 125 feet rode, works out to be a scope of 5 to 1. First, we'll ramp up the power to 500 pounds of thrust and then begin a veer. The boat will be moving sideways at just under 2 knots, all the way through 180 degrees of arc. I've got the motion of the playback sped up 4 times. This seems to be a nice speed for keeping the video reasonably short, but it allows us to see how much motion there is with the anchor. And in my view, this is not a lot of motion. We can see those seashells there. They're staying roughly in the same ballpark as the anchor cranks on around. If you remember from the previous rope-only test, the larger 45-pound Mantis also executed 180 degrees of veer just great. That was at a higher thrust setting. The bigger anchors got 840 pounds. Now we stopped veering and we're just pulling straight ahead with increasing thrust. Again, we're still at 4 times playback speed, and we're seeing some motion. And now we're back down to normal real-time playback speed. The highest thrust that I tested here with this segment is just under 1,100 pounds, and the boat speed was moving about 2 knots, so I cut it off here. That was quite a bit of motion throughout the whole straight line high thrust portion of this, but again, the veering part, the anchor stayed put very, very nicely. So after seeing all that motion after the veer, I wanted to get an idea of how much holding the anchor would have without the veer. So this is just a straight line pull. We've got the camera speed or the playback speed at 4 times here. Unfortunately, the anchor moved into a little cloud of turbidity, so we can't quite see the motion perfectly. But here we are at the max power that the boat can achieve, 1,150 pounds, and if it was moving much, we'd see those clouds sort of drifting by, and they're not. So it would appear, for this seabed anyway, that veering degrades this anchor's maximum holding capacity.
Okay, now we'll do the Excel for the veering test. 25 feet of water, 125 rode, 5-to-1 scope, 80 feet of chain, veering.
As stated, this next anchor is the 17-pound Excel. I'm very close geographically to that previous Mantis test. Same depth, same road, same scope. Initial part here, I ramp up the power to 500 pounds. And by the way, I've got the playback speed up at 4 times, but I'll just mention that the interval between the power increases on all these is 10 seconds. So when I'm increasing power in real time, I do a 10 count. In any event, we're now at the target thrust of 500, and the veering portion has commenced. You can sort of see the seabed is sort of cracked, where I guess that's where the chain and perhaps the anchor is underneath there, moving sideways. Note that the anchor is not really moving anywhere. The camera tether is partially captured by the seabed, so I think the camera has gotten closer, so it's moved downward, and the anchor is moved on ahead, but this is a pretty short tether. It's my guess that the fluke of the anchor is directly right in the middle of the screen, right where those tethers enter. So now we're in the straight line portion, and I'm just ramping up power, and golly, there's just not a lot of motion. I think the camera's getting a little closer still, so it must have crept forward a few more inches. But this is great. Remember from the previous rope-only test, the anchor at this max power setting was moving along pretty good. It was still great performance given that small size, but the addition of the chain has improved the anchor to the point where it's just really not moving at all here at the high holding power. And sure enough, on retrieval, the anchor emerges just right in the center of the screen. So, yep, that anchor was very, very well buried. Here's a quick look at the final segment of a straight line pull test. So I had redeployed the anchor, no veering on this one, just straight line pull, just so we can get a comparison. And it's a little bit of a hazier or cloudier image, but it looks like real similar motion, just creeping along by the millimeter.
5-to-1 scope, 25 feet of water, sandy mud.
Next anchor is the 21 pound Spade S60. If you recall from the rope only veer test that I did in the previous video, this anchor did excellent. It did not move far at all during the 180 degrees of veer, and it didn't move much on the high power segment afterwards. So we'll get a good comparison here. So we've run up through the power. It did hold the targeted 500 pounds of thrust. Now the veering is commenced. Once again, we're watching this at 4 times playback speed. In the upper right, I think I can still see the initial setting track. So it hasn't moved far away from that. Maybe an anchor length, maybe a hair more. It's very, very good. Now that initial setting track is out of view, but it really hasn't moved far. You can rewind this and watch the shells and the seaweed there. I think the camera tether has become slightly captured and the camera has been pulled downward. We're now in the straight line portion of the test. And this is the final power setting. Very, very little motion. I'd like to be able to say this is better or worse than the Excel, but I can't see it. I think it's just almost identical. And the prediction is that the anchor is right in the middle of the screen, or I should say the back part of the fluke. It's a pretty short tether. It's maybe only about 3.5 feet long, and the camera is about a foot and a half above the seafloor. And on retrieval, sure enough, the anchor emerges right there in our view. Okay, last anchor at the Sandy Mud location today is the 22 Pound Rocna. The initial set is instantaneous. Note that there is perhaps an increase in the amount of shell in this particular spot. I can see a few more shells than normal, and maybe I can even hear the anchor sliding along a shell or two. So if you want to throw out this test right here, that's fine. In fact, in any testing, including mine, you're welcome to throw out any singular test. You really need to look at all of my testing as a whole and kind of look at multiple tests, and that's exactly what we're going to do here after this failure. The anchor releases at 395 pounds, and I'm going to give you 2 more tries with this anchor with even more scope. So we should get a real good idea of whether or not this anchor is performing in this seabed.
Okay, she let go at 2600 RPM on a straight line pull. Okay, Sandy Mud, Rocna 22 pounder, 7-to-1 scope, so it's 25 feet of water, 175 feet of road, and there's 80 feet of 5/16 chain. This will be a veering test.
Okay, we can see that the anchor has landed in a very typical looking part of this seabed. I don't see many shells at all. I see maybe one shell in the kind of the middle upper part of the screen, but if you look back, it's common to see a few shells here. In any event, I'm going to show you the sequence at real-time speed. No more fast playback, because I want you to see everything just perfectly, well, within the constraints of this turbid seabed. The tether, the left part of the tether there, is blocking the view of the shank. We just had a peek of it there a minute ago. So the anchor is just off to the left. It's not moving much at all. Again, each of these power settings are held for 10 seconds before they increase to the next level. And at the target of 500 pounds of thrust, the anchor is doing well. It's maybe creeping ahead just a hair. So the veering begins, and right away at the 5-degree point of the veer, the anchor releases completely. And while the boat is still moving briskly, and it kind of just lurched ahead there, the anchor reconnected and brought the boat to an immediate stop. So that was great. And I thought, well, okay, let's put it back to 500 pounds of thrust and continue the veer. We do see continuous motion, and once again, if you want to throw out this part of the test, you know, kind of a veering test after a release, okay, I'll buy that. That's not fair. But the first part of the test with the first release, that's fair play in my book. But not to worry, I'm going to give this another try at an even longer scope here in a moment, and you put all these last 3 tests together, and I think a very clear picture emerges. It's even clearer if you go back and look at the 2 other unmodified Rocna roll bar anchors that I've tested in this very seabed, and every one of them has exhibited significant flaws as a result of seabed adhesion to the fluke. Okay, that part's a theory. I mean, I think it's hard to argue with it, but that is my theory, that seabed packs into this fluke. There's a number of factors. There's a presence of a large diameter cross-section roll bar. There's an upturned fluke and a scoop shape, and it all conspires to pack seabed into the fluke. I've delved into that issue a lot with other anchors. I ended up modifying a Rocna. I modified a similarly shaped Mantis Supreme. But in any event, I continued the veer, and I thought, well, maybe from the top side it was doing well, but I was unaware that it was just continually moving until, I think it was about the 70-degree mark. I could kind of tell that we were moving not just sideways, but moving ahead a bit. But I just held the power steady, and at the 80-degree mark from the beginning, the anchor releases completely and does not reset. This mud fouling phenomena is not unique to this Rocna. I have tested a 33-pound unmodified Rocna, and I've got lots of footage of this exact same thing. Same with the 45-pound Rocna. Both those larger anchors were tested with all-chain rods. To me, it is it's not debatable. The roll bar Rocna has a flaw in this particular seabed.
Okay, it seemed to be holding the initial set at 3,000 RPM, and then right away, like 5 degrees into the veer, it released and then reset, and right away held 3,000 again. So I continued the veer, and then it released at 80 degrees from the beginning. Okay, it's the 22-pound Rocna. We'll be in 25 feet of water, sandy mud sight, 80 feet of 5/16 chain, and the balance is the nylon. We're going to have 225 feet of road. Scope will be 9:1.
So 9:1 scope is very generous, and this will be the last try for this anchor. If it fails to meet the performance of the other anchors even at this very high scope, we have to conclude that the anchor is deficient at these tests in this seabed. It is not deficient, though, at this high scope initially. It does hold the 500 pounds nicely, and it begins the veer nicely. It doesn't move much at all. I do have the playback speed up at 4 times just to keep the video at a reasonable length. And up topside in the boat, it all looked just perfect. As you can see, there's very little motion. And then right here, coming up on the 90-degree mark, we'll change the playback speed back to real time. You can see very little motion. So this is very good. If you could always ensure you had lots and lots of scope, I think the Rocna does okay. But as we see with the 90-degree mark, the anchor released completely.
Okay, it released at the 90-degree mark.
Okay, we've changed locations. We are now over in my soft mud seabed at Scow Bay. We'll start off with the 17-pound Mantis, and this anchor does really well here. My previous testing in this soft mud showed that Mantis anchors do very well in this substrate. So to establish a veering test thrust setting, I've gone ahead and first done a straight line pull with this Mantis, and I've got the camera speed rolling at 4 times in the first part of this straight line pull, and then I slow things down to normal speed here for the last portion. It ends up holding 630 pounds and releases at 690, but right around in this point somewhere, the roll bar is bending. The roll bar does bend back. We'll see it here in a minute on the surface. But bent anchor or not, that was really good performance for this seabed. It is a challenging soft mud.
Place. 6 feet of chain was packed with mud, and we did bend the roll bar. Roll bar bent.
Here's some still shots of that deflection. It's maybe 5 or 10 degrees back from its original position. You can see the gap there between those 2 plates. So I went ahead and straightened it back out here out on the field so I can continue testing the anchor. Now I know some of you safety crats are out there thinking, oh geez, he's going to impale himself with the end of that anchor. Well, I didn't. So there we go. I did successfully bend it back, however. It took all my weight. With all that gear on, I'm probably close to 180 pounds. And it took my weight plus a jerk, a bit of a bounce there. And I could feel it when I gave it a good solid bounce, and it bent right back to its original position.
Okay, that was successful. It's back straight. Maybe just a hair too far, but no, that's good. We'll go with that. It did bend back. Galvanizing looks like it hung on, so that's good. Flaked off galvanizing would be a problem.
Okay, with things straightened back out, we'll get back to the testing, and we'll get right with the veering test for the 17-pound Mantis. I've selected 335 pounds of baseline thrust during the veer. It's downgraded from the 500 pounds over in that other heavier seabed, simply because there just isn't as much holding power here in this soft mud. In any event, this anchor handles that 335 pounds of pull no problem, and we'll watch it at 4 times speed here. Well, we'll try to watch it. There's really not much to see. The turbidity is kind of high. This is a real long tether also. The camera is about 7 feet up off from the bottom, so we just don't get to see as much. But frankly, for this seabed, these pictures are great. I've had other testing here where we couldn't see anything. The anchor handles the veer all 180 degrees perfectly. I don't see much motion at all. And then, as with the other testing, after 180 degrees, if the anchor is still engaged, I straighten out the boat so that it just pulls in a straight line and increase power. Now, I'm going to limit the amount of power I'm doing here because I don't want to bend the roll bar again. And the limit is going to be 500 pounds of thrust. You can see just as these thrust settings are achieved, the anchor begins a little bit more motion. But I believe the anchor is traveling through the substrate, mostly horizontally. Maybe it's still diving, and this captured tether is pulling the camera straight down. And I don't think the camera goes too terribly deep into the seabed, but I think it's obviously smushing along on the surface there such that we cannot see what's happening. I couldn't detect much motion from the surface at all.
Okay, it held the veer no problem. It had at least, oh, let's call it 12 feet of chain was packed with mud. And after the veer, I stopped the power at 3,000 and it was holding fine, and I didn't go further because I didn't want to bend the roll bar again. And indeed it did not bend again. Roll bar's okay.
Next anchor here in the soft mud is the 17-pound Excel. I'm going to go ahead and let this deployment roll for you so you can hear all 80 feet of that chain dragging over the gunnel of the test boat. I have tested this anchor in this very seabed previously with the same 5-to-1 scope, but with much less chain. It was only 12 feet as opposed to this 80 feet of chain. But the anchor did very, very poorly at that time, and I surmised that maybe it was laying on its side, but if you go back and watch those last few seconds, I believe this anchor did set upright. I'm treating it very gently here. I started with a very low power setting, and I'm incrementally bringing it up nice and slow, giving it every opportunity. I mean, I'm actually giving it special treatment in the hope that maybe with this extra chain, this anchor can perform here. But we'll see at 220 pounds of thrust, it cannot. It releases. It came out on its side, almost was sort of upside down there in the initial part. Note that per my previous testing in this seabed, the larger number 5 sized Excels did very well in this seabed.
Max RPM was 2,000. No mud buried in any of the chain. No mud on the anchor. Scow Bay, 5-to-1 scope, mostly chain, 21-pound spade. Veering test will be at 2,400 RPM.
Okay, we've got the Spade S60 on the bottom and digging in initially quite nicely. Previous testing showed this anchor to be fair in this soft mud. The smaller roll bar and therefore thin fluked anchors performed much better in this soft mud. We saw quite a bit of motion here in the beginning of this ramp up to 335 pounds, and then as the veer gets going, though, it settles down. The anchor must have just kept it digging its way in and sawing that chain into the substrate, and the motion's pretty well stopped for the veer, so that's great. Then here, as we stop veering and start ramping up power, we get a little bit more motion. The camera tether does become captured or grabbed a hold of by the surface of the substrate there. It's a good sign. That means the anchor is nicely buried. But as we achieve the higher holding power here, I did slow the playback speed to real time now. We were at four times speed for that veer portion. And the anchor, or the camera, plunges into the seabed. It's at 500 pounds of thrust, and I don't believe the anchor released fully, but the motion was really fast. Once the boat gets up to about 2 knots or more, I call it quits and figure that if you are truly anchored, your boat will be washed ashore quite quickly at 2 knots, so that was the fastest I let it go.
10 feet of chain buried. It seemed to hold the veer fine. Last power setting was 3,000 RPM on the straight line portion.
Here's the tail end of just a straight line test of this spade. Again, no veering involved with this one. Just reset it clean and gave it a straight line pull. I want to see, what's the effect of veering on the holding power? Does it make it worse, like over in the heavy mud or sandy mud seabed? Or does it somehow make anchors better? And indeed, that's what I'm finding here. Apparently, during the long drawn-out veer, I think it just gives the anchor more time to bury, more time to saw chain into the seabed, and indeed, this anchor and others produce less holding.
Three feet of chain was covered in mud. Oddly, there's mud packed in to the ballast chamber. Wouldn't have expected that. Okay, Pound Rocna, 5-to-1 scope, 80 feet chain, balanced nylon, 25 feet of water, veering test. It'll be at 2400 RPM.
Okay, last anchor we'll look at in this video is the 22-pound Rocna. We're still in the soft mud seabed. That initial set there was instantaneous. It just dove right in and disappeared. I am showing you this, the initial setting and the veering portion at 4 times camera speed. There's not much to see. It's bad visibility, but the anchor doesn't move much. It's got a little bit of motion there. But I think it just digs right down in and gets the job done. It's similar to the 44-pound Rocna that I tested here. I did test the larger anchor before I modified it, and it did very, very well in this seabed. I think it did a little better after the modification. But it's in keeping with my observation that thin fluked anchors do better in this seabed. There's just no question about it. It's almost 100% correlation. So not much motion there at the end of the veer, and now we're in the straight line portion, so the boat is no longer moving sideways, and I'm just ramping up the power. I'm giving this to you at real-time speed. Again, it's 10 seconds for each power setting. Anchor must be well buried. The camera tether is captured. Bit of motion though. The anchor must be moving mostly sideways or horizontally at this time. Drags the camera on in, and it was similar to the Mantis. It was 690 pounds. I guess I should say it was similar to the Mantis during the Mantis's straight line only pull. During the Mantis's veer, I limited the afterward straight line pull to 500 because I didn't want to bend the roll bar again. But Rocna roll bars are much thicker and smaller size. They're strong. Not going to bend a Rocna roll bar easily at all. So the anchor did not release. I just stopped the test at the 690 pounds of pull because the boat was moving about 2 knots.
15 feet of chain was buried. And again, max was 3,600 after the veer. The veer was good at 2,400.
Last pull is just another straight line only, no veering, and like the spade, it doesn't hold as well as the pull that immediately followed the veer test. So that's interesting. Okay, so for the sandy mud seabed, the ranking is as follows. We have the Excel and the Spade up near the top. You really couldn't ask for much better. In the middle of the pack was the Mantis. It executed the veer very, very well, and it looked like it was going to hold the full Monty of that test boat, but nope, at about 1,100 pounds, it released completely. Rocna came out last. It could not hold the 500-pound initial thrust setting to begin the veer, and it couldn't do that until I increased the scope. Even at 9-to-1, it held that 500 okay, but then at the 90-degree point of the veer, it released. I have to mention that this is exactly the same ranking as occurred during the rope-only test. We could have to assume that all of the anchors did better with the chain, and the only reason we have to make an assumption is that I did not retest the 2 new anchors with rope only. And frankly, I'm reluctant to do so, in part because I was so thoroughly chastised for doing the rope only test to begin with. So I may not ever do another rope test, in spite of the fact that numerous respected sailors that I know personally have asked me to do rope-only testing because that's what they use. Now at the soft mud site, it's a completely different story, and I am not surprised. I've done enough testing at both these locations to now know that the results are flip-flopped. And in the case of this size range of anchors, that sort of reversing of performance is 100%. The Excel went from being the best anchor in the sandy mud to the worst anchor in the soft mud. The Rocna, it went from the worst anchor in the sandy mud to the best anchor in the soft mud. Now, you might dispute that ranking. I think the Mantis actually had more holding power in the soft mud, but it came at the cost of bending its own roll bar. And that, to me, that's a disqualifier. If an anchor bends in order to achieve a certain high holding power, that's not as good. We would rather have the anchors remain whole. And for that soft mud, I would go with this Rocna every time. So what's driving all this testing I'm doing? Some people suggest that maybe I'm on some anchor manufacturer's payroll, and to be honest, I wish I was. I'd love it. That'd be great. I could go out and play with boats and anchors and get paid. But no, I'm on no one's payroll. I get money from YouTube for the ads that you guys are watching. I get a few PayPal hits occasionally, a couple a month, and I get, what do I have, maybe 20 or 21 patrons. And thank you, everybody. People who are donating to me directly, I can't thank you enough. So if the money that's coming in is not covering the costs, and it's not, I mean, I spent $600 last week on anchors. What's driving all this? I would have to say it's my passion for this, what I find to be a very interesting study. Unfortunately, passion and science do not go well together. And what happens is my emotions sometimes come out in what I talk about, and I make little attempt to hide that, because I kind of believe in full disclosure. I mean, if I stood up here and tried to pretend I'm a robot, that's just not real. It's not who I am. What it means, though, is that I appear to be biased at times, and I've been called out for that, and I apologize for that. I probably do seem biased, and I guess I am, because I do like, personally, some anchors more than others. And again, I apologize for that. I can't help it. I am who I am, and I'm going to show you that. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody watching these videos. Again, thanks for the donations. Keep them coming. As always, anchor safely.